So what do you say? Is CapsLock a likable character or not? Because you could argue that he's very unlikable because he always makes jokes of others and so on, and that's intended, that's what the author wanted. Or you could argue that you can actually sympathize with the poor little boy who has problems at home and so on and so on. Post it in the comments if you want.
But now it is time to start the story once again. The story of demons, the story of darkness, the story of the one thing that we all hate. Trolls.
Chapter 11. The Game. The class greeted Fluttershy and watched as she carried a cage with 2 bunnies to the front of the classroom. She set them down and turned to smile at the students. She closed the classroom door and walked over to CapsLock. "You'd better be on your best behavior today," she whispered to him. He paid her little to no mind as she continued drawing. She glanced at his drawings and rolled her eyes after seeing an over-exaggerated picture of himself with what looked like a 5th leg coming out of his crotch. "Hello, every pony," Fluttershy began. "I'm here to talk to you about where babies come from. Something all you fillies and colts are going to need to know about." CapsLock, like many of the students, let out a sigh and rolled his eyes. "How long is it going to take?" he shouted. Fluttershy turned to look at the colt. "It won't take long," she said calmly. "If you had any questions, I'd be happy to answer them." The Pegasus turned back to the class and began explaining the basic differences between colts and fillies. CapsLock felt the need to shout the slang term for every technical term she listed. The class would laugh, but Fluttershy would simply wait for them to quiet down before continuing. The lesson progressed until Fluttershy got to the part where she had to describe the mechanics of sex. CapsLock's hoof shot into the air, and Fluttershy turned to look at him. "Oh, do you have a question?" she asked with interest. "Yeah," CapsLock said with a grin. "What's your favorite position?" Fluttershy began to blush and started stammering. That's no concern of yours, and today we will be talking about missionary." "Ha! You're a virgin, aren't you?" CapsLock shouted, pointing to Fluttershy. The expression changed from flustered to surprisingly calm. She took 2 steps toward CapsLock and looked him right in the eyes. He smiled at her, but it was his expression that faltered. "I'm glad you brought up that word," she said, loud enough for only the 2 of them to hear. "Class," she said, turning around and speaking to her regular volume, "can any pony tell me what a virgin is?" The class looked to each other in confusion, and before CapsLock could open his mouth, Fluttershy said, "A virgin is a pony that hasn't had sex yet. This colt here," she said, putting her hoof out towards CapsLock, "is a virgin. You should all be virgins at your age." "Fuck you!" CapsLock shouted. "I ain't a virgin. I bang bitches every night." "CapsLock, language!" Charlie shouted. "Having your virginity is nothing to be ashamed of," Fluttershy said calmly. "You should wait until you find the special some pony before giving it away." CapsLock looked down at his drawing angrily and began extending the 5th leg he'd given himself. Fluttershy walked back to the caged rabbits and opened the cover of the cage. She carefully removed one of the rabbits and held it up for the class to see. "This is Mr. Bunny," she said, nodding the creature with her cheek. "He is going to be helping us understand how mating works." She carefully placed Mr. Bunny into Mrs. Bunny's side of the cage and asked the class to gather around. The colts and fillies slowly got up from their seats and walked to the front of the classroom. CapsLock remained in his seat, adding giant circles onto his strong 5th leg. He listened to the class awed and giggled as Mr. Bunny wrestled with Mrs. Bunny. When the rabbits were done, Fluttershy put a sheet over the cage. "In a few months, Mrs. Bunny will have bunny babies," Fluttershy explained. She then looked at the students' faces to confirm they understood her lecture. "Any questions?" "Yeah, right here," CapsLock shouted, thrusting his sofa into the air. "Are you gay?" Fluttershy kept her back turned to the colt and again asked if there were any questions. Hey, CapsLock shouted. I asked if you're a guy. Show us how 2 males would do it. Well, Cars, if you have any questions, you can always ask either Shirley or me, Fluttershy said calmly. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I hope I helped you understand where faults come from. As Fluttershy left the classroom, the class clapped their hooves together politely. CapsLock felt the need to boo loudly, but still caught no attention from the Pegasus. I bet she likes it in the butt, he shouted after the door closed. CapsLock, Shirley said, putting her hoof against his head. You must constantly act out. Act out? You haven't seen me act out? CapsLock replied. The rest of the day was a non-stop argument between Shirley and the destructive court. He'd bring up religion during science discussion, conspiracies during history, and geography during math. It seemed the further off topic he could get the class, the more accomplished he felt. The CMC watched as their teacher and classmate did nothing but feed CapsLock more and more until the whole classroom was just a giant big argument. At the recess, CapsLock made his rounds onto the playground, writing up the isolated groups until they fought amongst themselves. Once the inner fighting began, he'd smile and move onto a new group. I think Fluttershy is the only pony he's had no effect on, Sweetbelle whispered to her friends. They were hiding under the jungle gym, watching as CapsLock instigated several fights. Shirley had all she could do to quell the fighting. But all she did was ignore him. It's not like she made fun of him like Twilight did, Scootaloo said. Where'd he go? Applebloom asked, looking around the playground. Shirley was across the playground, trying to separate Snips and Snails after CapsLock had sent them into a fight. It was the last place they'd seen the colt, and it's not like he could have gone far. Something wet dripped onto Sweetbelle's head, and she looked up to see CapsLock hanging from the monkey bars above them. He smiled and watched as another stream of saliva ran down from his tongue and dripped into Sweetbelle's face. "Oh, grass!" Sweetbelle said in disgust. "Go away, CapsLock!" "Free country, biatch!" CapsLock replied. He then turned to the other 2 fillies. "Now that you're older pony pals aren't here to help you, you're all mean." The 3 fillies got up and walked across the playground toward Shirley. CapsLock jumped in front of them and put his hooves out to stop him. "Where are you going? You're not going to complain to admin, are you?" he asked. "Only pussies report other players." The CMC walked around CapsLock and straight to Shirley. She had Snips on the one side of her, Snails on the other, and she winced every time either of them would shout at the other. Her expression was devoid of all emotions, and she seemed to look right through the fillies. Before any of them could say anything, CapsLock shouted, "Don't ban me, bro! Don't ban me!" Shirley looked from CapsLock, then down to the fillies. "What?" she asked flatly. Eventually, she gave up restraining Snips and Snails and let them crash into each other. Are you all right?" Sweetbelle asked her teacher. I'm fine," Julie responded lazily. "Do you girls need something?" They could tell their teacher was in no mood for their complaints. It seemed like CapsLock had finally got the best of her. Now, instead of dealing with him directly, she had to clean up his aftermath. It wasn't about who started the fight, it was about who was continuing it. No, we're fine," Applebloom replied, not wanting to bother her further. She and the others turned to go, only to see CapsLock smiling and making proud gestures at them, thrusting his pelvis similar to the way Mr. Bunny had done. The school bell rang, and the class returned to their seats. Shirley was done trying to teach anything for the day, and simply wrote, "Quiet reading," across the board. While the rest of the class were busy reading, CapsLock was busy writing his own book and reading it out aloud. "Then CapsLock took his sword and killed all the orphans and puppies and ugly fillies and—" "CapsLock," Shirley shouted at last. "It's quiet reading. Read quietly." "Oops, sorry," he apologized. He lowered his voice and continued on with his riveting novel. "And then CapsLock put his huge, gigantic Throbbing? Shirley stood up again and walked to the door, while CapsLock continued listing adjectives for whatever he was describing. She looked right at the class, and she pulled down the fire alarm. The siren began wailing, and the sprinklers doused freezing water all over the students. "Class, it looks like we're having a fire drill," she shouted over the siren. "Gather your things and go home." The students ran out of the building, shielding their belongings from water. Shirley stood by the door to make sure no pony was left behind. The water drenched her mane, and she looked very similar to Pinkie Pie on a bad day. Applebloom, Scootaloo, and Sweetybelle ran from the building, determined to evade CapsLock. They sprinted past a couple of confused firefighters and into the town. "I don't think Miss Shirley can handle that much more of CapsLock," Applebloom said, shaking the water from her mane. "Then it's up to us Cutie Mark Crusaders to stop him," Scootaloo shouted. "And Fluttershy will help us," Sweetybelle added. Applebloom and Scootaloo just gave her a confused look. "What?" she asked. "You mean Twilight is gonna help us?" "All Fluttershy did was ignore him. That's not going to stop him," Scootaloo answered. "And if it doesn't work, we can have him brother beat him up," Applebloom suggested, as they approached the Golden Oaks library. They knocked on the front door and waited for an answer. It was dark inside the tree, and it didn't appear either Spike or Twilight were home. Scootaloo began pounding on the door with her hooves, and eventually the door swung open on its free will. "Hello?" the three fillies said into the darkness. Their work echoed around the empty library. They took a few steps in and could hear a distant clicking noise coming from somewhere in the darkness. There was a staircase near one of the bookshelves, and the eerie glow was coming from the bottom of it. Scootaloo and Applebloom pushed Sweetybelle ahead of them and forced her to descend the stairs first. "Twilight, are you there?" Sweetie called down. The clicking noises had intensified, but no response was heard. They reached the bottom step and looked around nervously. Set in the corner, in the front of a bright screen, was Twilight Sparkle. "Twilight, it's Applebloom, and Scootaloo, and Sweetybelle," the fillies said, giving their names. "Are you all right?" Twilight turned slowly from the screen to look at her visitors. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her mane was a mess. "Hello, girls," she said without blinking. The words came out hoarse, as if she had been deprived of water. "Twilight, what are you doing down here?" Applebloom asked, approaching the purple unicorn. The blink of an eye, Twilight had snatched up the filly and held her right up to her face. Her eyes stared unfocused into those of the fillies. "Let me tell you about the Internet." Now we have an author's note. "I feel this chapter was not my best, but after the fifth rewrite I needed to get something out so I could finish the damn story."
It's funny that the story is so bad that the author didn't want to write it.
"No, you can't say that. That doesn't mean nothing. It could have been that the author was really just tired of the writing too long."
And you actually believe that story?
"Like when I told your mom that my dick was 10 inches long and made out of gold."
Just shut up, CapsLock. Just shut up. Only one more chapter.